Good afternoon, and welcome again to the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is the third presentation of the day. Earlier this morning, we had the apartment tenant testimony. Then we had just recently the apartment owner testimony, and now we're fortunate enough to have the hotel tenant's testimony. We've allocated 45 minutes for three presentations. To start, I want to welcome Larry Wood, Supervising Organizer of the Goddard Riverside Law Project and Family Council. Welcome, Larry, again.
Thank you. Push the button. Thank you, Steve. Okay, I'm going to kind of give you a broad overview and some explanations about SRO-related issues, and then both Dan and Brian will give more current testimony as well. So you have a lot of material before you. I know it's been a long day already. I'm going to start with the explanatory statement for Hotel Order number 44. You can refer to that. And I always like to make a tradition of thanking each of...
Part of your package?
Yes. It should... No, actually it was separate. There was... one is the explanatory statement, and then the next item I'll refer to is where it says testimony with my name on it. And then the last one will be single-family mansion can be delivered vacant. I'll be referring to that one next, the last.
Thank you.
So I do always make a point of thanking each and every one of you for what is largely a thankless task. You do get vilified on both sides, and you have to make a very difficult decision. I know in the past, a lot of people like to think the fix is in, and this is like a useless exercise, but I do know you guys really do deliberate. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. Historically, the 5 public members seem to vote as a block, and last year was a little different, but that's the way things worked out. It was kind of unique. But it is frustrating for a lot of folks because this one-size-fits-all rent increase, it really doesn't do justice to the variety of situations that actually exist out there. And we recognize rent increases are warranted sometimes. And others, we think people are making great rate of returns in their buildings, despite maybe some low rents in individual units within a building. But you always have to look at the rate of return on the building and how people are doing. So we're going to focus in on SROs, and I just want to share a little history and give you that picture. It's actually, a smaller part of the overall rent stabilized stock. We have over, I guess, 1 million rent regulated units as a rule of thumb, and we think there's about 45,000 units of rent regulated SRO housing left. There's far less registered with the HCR, but we do know that there's an underreporting and a failure to register a lot of the SRO units. Historically, in 1971, there was 165,000 units of SRO housing, and as you know, you can't build new SRO housing. It was banned in the 50s, and over time, the city has, raised its housing maintenance code and the regulations for building new housing. So SRO housing was seen as substandard housing, and there was J51 benefits and other things encouraging the demolition and conversion of SROs. Through the 1970s, there was, by any means necessary, landlords were emptying and converting a lot of the SROs into co-ops or tearing them down, particularly in Midtown, assembling larger lots and building bigger buildings. And they kind of went overboard, and people recognized that SRO tenants were really being pushed out and vilified. The SRO Tenants' Rights Coalition was formed in the late 70s. It led to the formation of the SRO law projects, and then a lot of laws protecting SRO tenants. In 1986, there was a 1-year moratorium on the demolition and conversion of SROs. It was the famous Blackburn report, and they did a survey of what was left, and they found 65,000 units. So there's 100,000 units were lost over a 15-year period. It's like about 2/3 of the stock. And we've been doing everything possible to preserve this housing because people could see, the loss of SRO units and then the rise in the shelter system. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out. You destroy low-income housing available for singles, and you don't replace it. Of course, homelessness is going to grow. So it's a very important resource that's still out there that we need to preserve. There's different types of SROs, depending on when the buildings were converted, what year, what codes might have applied. 1 and 2 family houses were broken up into rooming houses. Bigger apartment buildings may have been broken up into SROs of different types. So in the explanatory statements, if you look at the second page there, the definitions list the 5 different types of SROs. And in the past, there's sometimes been different guidelines for each type of SRO. Sometimes the rooming houses got an increase where the bigger hotels didn't. I've always wondered why apartments, it's just one size fits all, and there's so many different types of apartment buildings. But SROs, there's actually 5 different categories. There's the Class A residential hotels, which Ann Cunningham, AC, if people know her, who's been coming out for well over 30 years to these meetings. She lives in one on 73rd Street, and Cecilia asked about possibly touring one. We might set you up to visit Ann's building. And anybody else would like to visit an SRO, we certainly would try to make those arrangements and encourage you to come out and see one. The second day, you have rooming houses, a Class B, multiple dwellings with fewer than 30 sleeping units. And this can vary anywhere from a 6, 8, 10 unit rooming house. You see a lot of these in Harlem, Central Harlem, Chelsea, and other parts of the city. Then there's the single room occupancy building, a Class A multiple dwelling that was broken up into a rooming house. It's called a Section 248. There's a Class B hotel. Some buildings were just built as hotels, and that they tend to be in that category. And then there's very few of the lodging houses left, but those were in the Bowery. There's one still in Midtown, the Vigilant at 33rd and 8th, I think, or 32nd and 8th. But these are very small units where people live. They're actually partitions with the chicken wire kind of ceiling, so they're really the smallest of the SRO units. The minimum size is supposed to be 80 square feet for a single and 130 square feet for 2. And compared to the micro units that was being discussed at 200 to 250 square feet, those would be palatial compared to what many SRO tenants live in. They would love to have a micro unit compared to their SRO unit. So that's kind of the big picture. I'm going to refer in my packet the first material you have. It says single room occupancy dwellings in Community Board 7. So it's just a snapshot of what's happened to SROs in Community Board 7. It's a little bit dated, but it's some of the best data we have to illustrate. So just flipping up through there, this is a much longer report, and I just took some excerpts out. The guiding questions are: what are SRO units, why are they important, how many in Community Board 7, how many have been lost. So I've just covered some of that, defining what an SRO is. Flip the page to, it says breakdown of SROs in Community Board 7. They found over 13,000 units. Of the SROs around the city, and the numbers I gave you earlier, the bulk of them, probably 70%, are in Manhattan, and even the bulk of them are in the Upper West Side and in Chelsea, Hell's Kitchen area. That's where the majority of the hotels, the bigger hotels, exist, in a lot of rooming houses. So this chart is interesting. It illustrates, there's a little pie chart there showing you how these units are actually were used. And you have nonprofit, about 2,000 units managed by nonprofits, including Goddard Riverside. Is one way we've preserved, not the only way, but one way we've preserved a fair number of SROs. Servant, B, those are small in some of the big apartment buildings. There might have been maids' quarters up on the top floor. So we don't deal with those too often, but a couple of hundred of those exist throughout the Upper West Side. Many SRO units are also utilized as dormitories. Colleges net lease a lot of the rooms. There's a building up on 110th Street. It's known as College Residence Hotel. It was an SRO. It's all Columbia students at this point. Then you see D, legal hotel use. So out of these 13,000 units, about 3,200 are used by rent-stabilized SRO tenants. And then you see the market-driven E, over 6,000 units, twice the number, are used by placements by the city programs, Division of Homeless Services, DHS, AHASA, folks who have HIV, they get placed. So a lot of programs, the city rents out these places at great expense and very profitable for the owners. So and then there's the illegal hotels use, the Airbnb usage. There is also legal tourism in the hotels. It really depends on the zoning and the fire code regulations and the type of SRO it is. Some of the big hotels, there's at 77th Street, there's a Belclair, and across the street is a big hotel known as the Ben Franklin. They can legally do transient short-term rentals, and they're in the commercial zone. So those buildings are mostly used by tourists at this point. The old Ben Franklin, it's at 222 West 77. We've got about 40 tenants left out of the 400 units in that particular building. And but most of the use is illegal. It's not zoned for short-term daily rentals, or the building is not classified that way, and they don't have the appropriate fire protections. So we've been really battling the illegal use, which means you can't rent less than 30 days. You can rent for 30 days at a time if a tourist wants to rent that long, but you can't do daily rentals. One thing to note about how somebody becomes a rent-regulated tenant in an SRO, they're statutory tenants. They don't have leases. So if they move into an SRO as a tourist, as a transient, just needs a place to stay for a few months, after 6 months, they become a permanent tenant and are subject and protected by rent stabilization laws. The other provision is when they move in, they're supposed to be given a notice of their rights, a hotel rights notice. It tells them the room is subject to rent stabilization and they have a right to do what's called a lease request. It's not a request and they don't get a lease. What it does is trigger your rights to become a rent-stabilized tenant. So we try to educate folks, if they're renting a room in a building in an SRO subject to rent stabilization, they have a right to do a lease request. Owners don't want tenants doing lease requests and triggering their rights. So if they're renting to a tourist, they want to see that they have a passport, a credit card from, out of the country. An average New Yorker is not going to be able to rent a unit in an SRO that's subject to stabilization. It's really rare that we see people do lease requests nowadays because of the intense screening that goes on. So I just want to make that clear. So just on the next page there, it says lost SRO units. You can see the little charts there. The lost B units in Community Board 7, B units converted back to 1 and 2 family homes in Community Board 7. There is a process to convert these buildings back, and there is a little protection. Before owners can convert their buildings, they have to get a certificate of non-harassment, and they look at a 3-year window prior to applying for permits from the buildings department to convert the building. So we get notices. We get a couple every month. We go out and investigate. Unfortunately, more often than not, the building is vacant. But when we find tenanted buildings, we'll talk to the tenants. When there is a history of harassment that created the vacancies in the building, HPD can hold a hearing and can actually deny a permit. Ann Cunningham, with her building, actually went through this process this past year. Dan will be referring to in his testimony. Their landlord did not get a certificate of non-harassment. It was denied. So there was atrocious history there, which we can tell you about later on. Flipping to the next page is a breakdown of market-driven B units in Community Board 7. So they show you what's the alleged illegal hotel use, the city placements, and just a nice little pie chart there. Next page, it shows a number of the illegal hotels that have illegal rentals in them. You can see they're not on Broadway, a lot along West End Avenue, Amsterdam Avenue, and they're not supposed to be doing rentals less than a month, and many of them are. Now the illegal hotel legislation has been tightened up. You're probably familiar, Airbnb has this huge multi-billion-dollar effort to undo legislation we were successfully able to get passed in Albany a number of years ago. Despite their millions, we're doing pretty good holding them off, and we hope we can continue to do that. Airbnb would love to be able to have their model work here in New York. They're going to make billions of dollars when they do their IPO offering and the like. All right, the next page, city placement. This is a little dated, but still reflects the reality of many buildings having placements by the city at great expense. They pay sometimes between $1,500 and $3,000 a month to place a homeless individual in some of these units. It's pretty incredible. In fact, one or two of the buildings that had illegal tourists in them, and they had to pay tens of thousands of dollars in fines and stopped, they turned around and then net leased renting to the city for city placement. So it didn't go back to permanent rent-regulated housing as we wanted, but they're still making enormous profits by renting to the city programs instead. So, and then that last page there shows you some of the buildings that have been preserved by nonprofits acquiring them. And it's about 2,000 units. So that these 2,000 and the other 3,200 units that are rent stabilized, that's of the 13,000 units in Community Board 7. So it kind of gives you a snapshot. Okay. The next set of material, and I guess what I wanted to explain, going back to the first chart, the explanatory statement, the pages there, I copied historically the Rent Guideline Board adjustments that have been approved over time. And, you know, in the early, I guess back when we had high inflation, the first number of increases were typically pretty high, you know, anywhere from 4%, 8, 10%, 9%, up into 81. 82 was 10% guidelines. The law project formed that year, and we started organizing and bringing tenants down. And then in the 12th order, it dropped down to 2%. And we've been successful at conveying to your predecessors what's going on in the industry. And there's also something kind of unique that's applied to SROs, and it is called provisos. And this is one way to get around that one-size-fits-all guideline, and that when certain conditions exist in a building, the guideline would be 0 rather than a modest increase. One such proviso was warehousing, you know, withdrawing units from the rental market. It's hard for an owner to say, I need a rent increase if he has half a building empty. You need to increase your rental income, rent out your empty units first, and then you can qualify for the guideline increase. Additionally, where we've been able to document that owners are making enormous profits on non-rent stabilized rentals, the tourists, the city placements, or the students, they don't warrant a rent increase. So the proviso language over time has changed a little bit, but it basically accounts for these conditions in these particular buildings, that the owners are making a great rate of return, the rent increases that they could potentially offer. There's almost nothing no incentive you can give for these owners to keep these as rent-stabilized units in some respects. We're working very diligently to make sure they rent to folks, but they can make great profit elsewhere. Some of the predecessors, the landlord reps, have said, you got to give some incentive to owners if they're going to keep these as rent-stabilized units. You give 100% rent increase, it's still going to be much more profitable to rent to a college or to a city program or to a tourist on a short-term basis. So don't be seduced by that notion. It doesn't work. The provisos have been very important protections for the SROs and has been able to distinguish between where an increase might be warranted in some situations and where owners are making, you know, a lot of profit. It just doesn't apply. So there had been a long history of those provisos on and off in various years. In other years, it's been a 0 guideline across the boards. The last number of years, there's been a series of memorandums and memos that the board and Andrew has been involved with putting together. So the next packet, you'll see memos from 2007, 2009, I think. There's the other one. Yeah, here it is. 2009, 2012, and 2013. And what the board wanted to determine was how many buildings and how many units were affected by these provisos. And I understand Andrew was able to get data from DHCR on how many units were registered with the state, and then cross-reference that with data from Department of Finance and looking at C of Os to see how many units actually existed in the buildings. And they were able to find some very interesting information. The legal size piece of paper that you have is kind of a chart where I've pulled out some of that data, which I'm going to find mine. Here we go. So if I'll refer to the memos and you can look at them at your leisure, but I'm going to just highlight some of the most pertinent information. The chart, the legal size chart, if you want to refer to that now, that would be helpful. The table that you see is actually from the last time there was enough of a significant sample size to have a chart with some of the demographics pulled from data from the housing and vacancy surveys. I think now just not enough data to, is that right, Andrew? There's just not enough data, information to update these charts at this point.
They don't, there's so few units that they can't extrapolate any reliable data from the HVS, so they don't take a look at the state, the hotel universe anymore.
Yeah. So this is an old chart, but it dates 96 and 2002, but it kind of gives you a snapshot of the units, the percent occupied or not, the income, the racial background. So it just gives you some demographic information. And then what I did was pulled some of the information from the memos that the board did to kind of fill in the blanks. And the memos, I told you the dates, they use data from prior years. So the 2007 memo is 2005 data from DHCR, 2008, 2011, 2012. So I said earlier we estimate 45, 50,000. We don't know how many SRO units are left out there, but what's been registered at DHCR is probably less than half. And it goes up and down. In 2005, there was over 15,000 units in 445 buildings. The following year, it jumped. We found 7,000 units got registered, an additional 7,000 in just a few more buildings. Then it dropped again to 15,000 units and was up again a little bit to 16,000 units. So we know there's underreporting with DHCR, but this is the information that the board was able to get from DHCR. Again, in the memos, there's information about how many units are vacant. It appeared in both the 2011, 2012. Both cases, about 2,000 units of the 15 or 16,000 were being warehoused. The exempt, these are the percent of units that were not rent regulated, were being used for other purposes. That's how they're listed. And you can see how it's increased from 26% to over 35% of these units are not, they're saying are exempt from rent stabilization. And clearly, the thousands and thousands of other units are not registered. Those owners, of course, think they're exempt from rent stabilization. They should be registering their rents. The median rents, it's kind of extraordinary, the numbers, and if you look at the memos, these are higher than apartment rents. And despite the rent freezes and the provisos, the median rents have continued to go up over the years. It's extraordinary to me that despite the rent freezes, these increases keep going up. Some of that reflects the tourist rentals, or they're falsely registering at higher rents than they should be, but these median rents are going up despite the rent freezes that you have passed. The other thing that the memos had illustrated was as the proviso had increased, initially it was like 50% or more are being used, not used by rent stabilized tenants, the proviso wouldn't apply. In 1 year they went from 20% or more were being used by non-rent stabilized tenants. They went to 15%, and we went from 25% of the buildings wouldn't qualify to 50% of the buildings wouldn't qualify. There was a period where there was a question about whether provisos were lawful or not. There's been dueling memos actually in the past from the Corp Counsel and legal aid about whether or not these provisos were permissible for apartments. There was a landlord proviso a number of years ago. We called it the poor rent tax. The landlords called it the low rent supplement for units less than $1,000. They got a higher guideline. It was a flat rent increase. The board was sued over that, and it was upheld. So provisos apparently are lawful. It is a tool you could potentially use in the future. So in those years where there was a question about whether provisos were lawful or not, we made the case that because the majority of buildings wouldn't qualify for the increase anyway, you should do zero across the board. And it's only gotten worse for tenants in that respect. There are more tourist rentals, less rent-stabilized tenants, so there's more and more buildings have a higher and higher percentage of units that are not stabilized and not being rented out for that purpose. So, in that effect, we are again requesting a zero guideline because it really, across the board, most of the SROs are quite profitable. Even in the case of the rooming houses, you can look in these memos for those mean and median rents. The last thing I just wanted to highlight, I don't want to be a testimony hog, I want to save some time for my colleagues. The last piece, this is a tenant came in just within the last month. He lives in a rooming house at 140 West 75th Street. And I found this extraordinary. Create a 21-foot wide single-family mansion can be delivered vacant. You don't usually see that up on the websites. So that first picture, and if you turn the page, we don't often get to see rent rolls for buildings, but they list the rent roll for this particular SRO. FM means fair market. So you have, in these units, tenants paying up to $3,500 for guest studios. This was a 19-unit, was converted in 1920, and it was called bachelor apartments, bachelor units. So there's 9 apartments and 8 SRO units. So they're getting a pretty penny for those units at this point. I guess they think they've got them deregulated. I don't know if they were all appropriately deregulated, but that's the claim. You do see there's rent stabilized, the garden rear, somebody's paying $829.67. I don't know how they can guarantee the building would be delivered vacant if you have a rent stabilized tenant in that room. And then apartment 18 is an SRO tenant paying $563. So there's at least 2 rent regulated tenants left in this rooming house. This is a pretty incredible rent roll if you look at it. And the next page gives you their expenses. Their rent roll is $374,000 a year. And their expenses, total estimated annual expenses, $103,000. So I think they're making a pretty good rate of return in this building. But they're marketing it for $12 million, and they're guaranteeing it could be delivered vacant. So it kind of just gives you an idea of what's going on in some of these rooming houses that exist. And there's a lot of pressure on those Harlem tenants who live in a lot of those rooming houses. There's a lot of applications for certificate of non-harassments. We deal with a lot of rooming houses that just have a handful of tenants in them. They're under enormous pressure. They're being offered big buyouts. And often it could be a down payment on their own homelessness because taking $10,000, $12,000, even $50,000, you can't find other affordable housing. And they can go through that money fairly quickly in a new rental and be back where they, not better off than where they are. So it gives you kind of the big picture, and I hope you will listen to us in terms of another zero guideline. Brian, hope I saved some time for you.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy your presentations and learn a lot about a subset of the housing that I'm not that familiar with. A question, and it always this always happens in sort of the philosophical aspects of what we're trying to do here. How many years have we had 0% increases on our SRO?
Not enough. 3. Actually, the table's there, but it's the last 3 years.
Just
4 out of the last. It's 4 out of the last 5, but it's.
Oh, right. 4 out of those. But 3 consecutive.
Okay.
Yeah, the fourth one was a combined.
Yeah, it's sort of the chicken and an egg. Do you find that, is there some thought that having 0% increases creates some of the problems in disincentive for landlords to maintain the SROs, therefore they seek other forms, either through buyouts or through, Airbnb or, legal and illegal sources of being able to generate income off of these units when they've seen consistent 0% increases?
I understand. This goes back to the 1970s. I mean, there's these buildings and these sites where they're located are just far more valuable for other purposes. Demolishing a building and building a high-rise happened to a lot of SROs in Midtown. We really do want to maintain these as rent-stabilized housing, and we do our utmost to make that happen. But there's just so many other lucrative uses. Students need affordable housing in the city. NYU net leases buildings. American Music and Drama School, there's two SROs on my block at 85th Street, 207 and 209. A handful of SRO tenants left, and mostly dance and drama students come and go. The city is desperate. I mean, the homeless shelters, we're up to 60,000 people in the shelter system. They're desperate, needing places. So there's more nonprofits net leasing these rooms for that need. I wish there was an incentive big enough. Maybe if enough Section 8 money was available for tenants to help supplement their rent. But no, I mean, you can't give a guideline that's going to be enough of an incentive that they're not going to look at these other lucrative uses.
And I just had a quick second question. Are new SROs being created, new construction SROs? Or
only nonprofits. We actually have been proponents of new SRO construction. There's probably more. In fact, there's a study. Jill Hamburger, an urban planner, did a study a number of years ago. There's more illegal SROs now in New York City than legal SROs. There are still, a lot of basement apartments, 1 or 2 family houses, particularly throughout Queens. In Chinatown and other communities, buildings that have been chopped up. Some of them are fire traps, and you hear about it in terms of enforcement and a crackdown, certainly when a fireman or people get hurt and killed in a fire. But we maintain that you can upgrade and make these safe places, but the laws has to be changed. And there's been legislation proposed back in the 80s. Peter Vallone was the city council speaker. It got some attention, but it never went anywhere. Mayor de Blasio actually said he wanted to look at, legalizing basement apartments. There's a group in Queens, Chaya, who's been proponents of this. The micro units is like the newest look at creating these types of units. Right now, it's only nonprofits, so you can build dormitories, nursing quarters for nurses who are in training, that type of thing. So a nonprofit could build an SRO, but the for-profit sector can't, and we'd like to see it come back. SROs are cheaper to run on a square foot basis. They make more money on a square foot basis, so there can be a market for it if they were legally allowed to be built. So I do want to save time for my colleagues.
Just a clarification. So is the supportive housing at Navy Green, is that considered an SRO?
Which one?
The supportive housing that was built at Navy Green by the Navy Yards?
It was new construction?
It's new construction, yeah.
Some of the new supported housing are self-contained units that have their own bathrooms.
Yeah, they do. I've toured it. They do have their own bathrooms, so that puts it out of the category.
Yeah, so that's more of a micro unit. And some of the SROs that have been preserved as supported housing have social workers on site and the like. Some of them, like our building at 87th Street, Capitol Hall, 166 West 87, we actually just did an extensive remodeling of the building so that everybody has their own bathroom and kitchen unit. We have another building, the Senate, where they are still shared bathrooms and kitchens. Brian?
Any other questions? I apologize. That's okay. Okay. And at this point, Dan Evans, tenant organizer of Goddard, Riverside? No, Brian.
Brian Sullivan. Staff, that's okay.
Staff
Dan's a good-looking
attorney.
guy. I don't mind being confused with him.
Brian Sullivan, staff attorney, SRO Project, and MFY Legal Services. I apologize.
No, not a problem. My name's Brian Sullivan. I'm a staff attorney at MFY and the SRO Law Project. We mostly do anti-eviction work, defending SRO tenants who are being evicted or bringing cases to improve conditions in SRO buildings. As in years past, Larry has covered, the bulk of and probably the most important ground. Just a few things I want to emphasize from his testimony and from the current situation. I mean, first off, the situation this year is the same as last year in terms of the balance between tenants and SRO building owners. It's the same as the year before that. Nothing has changed. So the exact same policy considerations that would cause the RGB to give a 0% increase in years past continue to be in place now. And Larry sort of laid those out in more detail. I think the second main point I want to emphasize along these lines is at the beginning, Larry had said you got to look at the rate of return for SRO owners and you got to compare that to the situation of SRO tenants. Many SRO tenants are close to homelessness. This is housing of last resort, especially after this sort of historic collapse of the SRO market that Larry described. You get a population of New Yorkers who are many on fixed income, many who work but very low-wage marginal jobs. And although there are different types of SRO housing, there is a common thread. Their tenants are very poor. And any increase would have a dramatic effect for them. If you do a small increase of 1 or 2%, if your rent takes up 5/6 of your budget, this is several days worth of essentials that are getting taken away, that are getting sucked into the rent instead of being used to pay for food, medicine, clothes, whatever it is exactly. And so that's a common thread amongst all, virtually every SRO tenant. On the other side of that equation, and again, as Larry has laid out, owners don't need this increase. They didn't need it last year. They don't need it this year. On the east side, where we work, there are luxury hotels such as the Martha Washington Hotel or the Jolly Madison Hotel that do nightly rentals at $300-400 a night and continue to have some SRO tenants. Their income, the end of the year for them has no, whether they come in the red or come in the black, has no bearing on what happens to the SRO tenant rents. They are going to make money or lose money depending on what happens with the sort of more transient hotel business. Increasing the rent would not benefit them in any way, shape, or form. We talked about Department of Homeless Services placements. There were a couple articles in 2013 about large SROs that had been, large chunks of these large SROs had been given over to temporary homeless placements where you can get as much as $3,000 a month from the city for a rent-stabilized room that should be renting, for maybe $400 or $500 a month. And in certain circumstances, that's a perfectly legal use. Might not be the best policy, but it's a legal use. Owners are getting money out of that. SROs are also given over to three-quarter houses, which are sort of the shadier side of homeless, temporary homeless placement, where they offer a sort of, say they offer a therapeutic environment, but really it's just temporary housing sort of coupled with a Medicaid scam. There's a lot to talk about there and not necessarily immediately before this board. If a tenant moves out, it's to a shelter in the vast majority of circumstances, or to some sort of high-cost housing situation, something that's going to cost the city a lot of money, whether that be a shelter, some sort of supported housing. Whereas when they can live in, say, a private SRO that's getting low or no increases over the year, these are tenants who are able to live independently. There's just nowhere else for them to go if they move out. And so broader policy changes are needed within the realm of SROs that are beyond the scope, unfortunately, of what the RGB can do. So we do need new units. We do need structured legalization. However, the RGB can do a 0% increase, and that is appropriate. Again, the considerations are the same. The balance that has to be struck, and as Larry said, we know it's a very challenging balance, but the balance that needs to be struck between the needs of the tenants and the needs of the owners, more clearly than in any other circumstance you guys are going to be evaluating this year favors the tenants. They are low income, they are frequently very desperate. This is simply not the case for the owners. And so once again, we do urge that a 0% increase be instituted this year.
Any questions, comments? Okay. Lastly, and I'll get it right, Dan Evans, tenant organizer in Goddard, Riverside, SRO Lot Project.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'll be as brief as possible, and I apologize if anything is duplicative of what Larry or what Brian has said. My name is Dan Evans. I'm a tenant organizer at the Goddard Riverside Law Project. Our office has been providing free legal representation and organizing support to SRO tenants on the Upper West Side for over 30 years. I want to start by saying, thank you, and we celebrate the board's decision for voting for a 0% increase last year for SRO tenants. And as Brian said, nothing has really changed. So, what my testimony is really going to focus on is, sort of the conditions that SRO tenants are facing and the conditions that SRO owners are facing, which justify the board, again, voting for a 0% increase for SRO tenants. So, looking at the 2015 income and affordability study, it's alarming for New Yorkers generally. And like Brian said, we're dealing with a special class of the population, traditionally low-income tenants. So what the 2015 income and affordability study showed is that the median gross rent-to-income ratio for all tenants in Manhattan, or in New York, is 33.8%, and it's even higher for rent-stabilized tenants. Looking at rent-stabilized tenants, 33.5% of them pay over 50% of their household income in rent. And we see this every day with the SRO tenants that we serve. I have clients who are paying 85% of their income towards their rent. It's absolutely alarming. So, as Brian was saying, SROs are a housing of last resort for low-income people who would otherwise be homeless. Thousands of hardworking people, as well as a disproportionate number of elderly and disabled individuals, call SROs their home. Men who rely on SSI, disability pensions, food stamps, and other sorts of public assistance as their sole source of income. And many of our clients routinely report incomes of $10,000 or less per year. With vacancy rates in apartments during 2014 costing below $800 at just 1.1%, and homelessness at a nightly average of over 54,000 persons per night, which, as of, that was based on a 2014 report. Yesterday, Larry and I did a little research and found that the Coalition for the Homeless just released that it's actually over 60,000 individuals are living homeless nightly in New York City. The city just cannot afford to increase rents on what is one of the last sources of truly affordable housing for low-income New Yorkers. As far as SRO building owners are concerned, these low vacancy rates suggest that building owners have little to no trouble renting their units to permanent tenants. SRO landlords have found more profitable uses, though, we've seen. Larry mentioned a number of them in terms of the contracts with Department of Homeless Services, HRA, HASA, and then net leasing to universities in the area. Also, what we've found is extremely common in single-room occupancy buildings is illegal hotel activity. So I just wanted to touch on that a bit. To discuss one example on the Upper West Side, the Hotel Alexander, which is a residential SRO building located on 94th Street. It bills itself as an extended stay hotel specializing in stays of 30 days or more, but nonetheless, looking at the website yesterday, it still lists daily rates that correlate to rents of $1,740 to $2,310 per month, which are well in excess of the appropriate monthly legal rents that the building would otherwise be confined by. SRO owners use websites like Airbnb to rent stabilized rooms to unsuspecting tourists, and it's become such a significant problem in New York that Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General, issued subpoenas for a list of hosts who may be breaking the law by renting permanent units on a transient basis. He later issued a report in October of 2014, on findings showing that 72% of all Airbnb rentals in New York City are illegal, and that these commercial users that we're talking about are controlling a grossly disproportionate share of the rentals. 6% of hosts supply 36% of units and earn 37% of the revenue. The report that Attorney General issued doesn't solely reflect SROs, it also applies to apartment buildings as well. It still is compelling evidence that owners stand to profit by renting to short-term transient guests rather than permanent tenants. As Larry mentioned, SRO owners are also keeping affordable units off the market by warehousing them. As tenants are harassed out, die, or evicted, their units become removed from the market. Owners then refuse to rent to new tenants, and units will lie vacant for years. This is a very widespread problem, and to give an idea of how widespread it is, looking only at our catchment area, which is the west side of Manhattan, we're aware of several buildings with large numbers of vacant units. Some of the more egregious examples are the Imperial Court at 307 West 79th Street has 63 permanent tenants housed in a building with 227 units. The Alexander, which I mentioned earlier, at 306 West 94th, and there's actually a typo here, as of yesterday there are only 5 remaining tenants in the building with 114 units. And most egregiously, we have the Camden at 206 West 95th Street. There is 1 tenant left in a building with 207 units. And since these owners are, and other owners of other buildings are, with warehouse units, are foregoing rents from permanent tenants, they certainly do not deserve any guidelines increases. For those reasons, we ask again that the board vote for a 0% increase on SRO buildings. So thank you for your time and the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you. Any questions from the board?
In your experience, in terms of these tenants applying for SCREE or DREE, are there issues they come up with because they don't have a lease? How do they prove what they're paying in rent? And how do they show that it's, that they qualify for SCREE? Do they, because they don't get a lease from year to year. So what's your experience in applying for SCREE?
One additional point, they're not eligible for Section 8, correct?
So they are potentially eligible for Section 8, and there are a number of different sort of Section 8 type scenarios, some building-wide stuff, some individual tenants have them. Honestly, it's rare. I think of only 1 or 2 clients off the top of my head who have Section 8. In terms of SCREE or DREE, yes, we have to get creative. They don't have leases, and sometimes it's a little bit of a battle with the landlord to get a lease. Sometimes we're able to get it, frequently we're not, and so then we just do sort of a combination of things. You get the rent registration, I write a letter, we get a few rent receipts. You just kind of cobble something together, and the Department of Finance has been really good working with us on that. So we almost never have, we have a short-term problem of getting everything together. Longer term, we're successful on those types of situations.
But as you know, SCREE is rent-free, so your rent wouldn't go up. So having a zero guideline saves us all a lot of work. So those SRO tenants who would be eligible for SCREE, we don't have to worry about them recertifying and all the paperwork involved.
What percentage actually does get SCREE or DREE? Do you have a clue?
I couldn't tell you offhand. There is a percent, but I wouldn't know offhand.
Is that why you're not asking for a rollback?
Well, I think some of the data, I think the price index actually for SROs was negative this year. I think it was really, 0.5 for apartments, it was minus 0.2. We thought we'd be pushing our luck to ask for rent rollback.
Some other...
We'll take it.
Actually, I was imagining this morning, recalculating hundreds of tenants' rents for a rent rollback. I would do it if you deemed it necessary. Certainly, these buildings are very profitable. We'd give tenants a break. So certainly if in the range of possible guidelines, if the range was -3 to 2 or whatever, certainly I'd like to see it on the table.
Thanks. Good.
So I have a question. So you mentioned that, you mentioned that some of these tenants are very poor, like they could be making up to $10,000. Are any of them on public assistance?
Yes, I ran the numbers for MFY looking over the past 7 years, and I didn't bring it with me, but if I'm remembering correctly, it's something like 20%, 25%, maybe even a little more than that, were city-provided public assistance, and then a larger chunk were SSI or SSD or something like that. But yes, there are many on public assistance. And that creates its own set of problems because the shelter allowances for a single person, $215 a month. There are rents out there of $215, and there's some that are actually even lower than that. I think Larry had talked about the cubicle-style room where it's just a large loft space divided with thin pieces of wood into small cubicles. Those rents can be very, very low. But even with a low rent like that, if it's $215 is your monthly allowance, there's no increase that you could realistically afford.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? Of course. Sorry.
If there was a subsidy program available for tenants that said that capped their rent to 30% of the income, and the rent above it would be paid through some other government program, would you guys be supportive of that?
I might have to think about that a little. Yes, absolutely. That would be wonderful.
Well, that's actually, there was a press conference the other day about the SCREE and DREE program, because the income eligibility was raised by the state from 29 to 50. But a number of the tenants there, particularly one I've worked with on 90th Street, she's actually an apartment tenant. She entered through DREE. She was paying 65% of her income, and her issue was, it's such a high rent burden for her. She'd love to have a rollback, so she was only paying a third. It'd probably be expensive, but even roll back to 50% would be great for her. She's now SCREE, she's retired, so her Social Security has gone up a little bit each month, and her rents remain frozen, so the rent burdens come down slightly for her. But a rent rollback or a rollback for SCREE to account for tenants who get into SCREE at really high rent burdens, they might have been affording their rent or paying 30 or 40% working, and then their retirement income could be cut in half or more, and all of a sudden their rent burden goes up and the SCREE is frozen at that high rate. So there's a lot of seniors who are paying really high rent burdens, and it would be a great relief for them to have it roll back to 30 or 40%. It would be great help. So I just want to end, I know that particularly the new members, we're going to ask Andrew if we can set up a meeting with you, and we could go over some of this in more detail if you need. And we'd welcome, if you want to tour an SRO, Cecilia had asked if that was a possibility, and we'll certainly can make those arrangements as well. So if you want to tour an SRO, and we'd ask for an audience with the new members as well. Thank you.
Yes. On that note, I want to thank the speakers once again. I do want to thank the RGB staff for everything you've done, and lunch. I will remind everyone that we will meet next week at CUNY Graduate Center, 6 p.m. And do I have a motion to adjourn this long meeting? Anything else? Yes.
Do we have to get the proposals in on the ranges in advance? We don't do that this week?
No, that's just for the final vote. That's when you're approving final language. This is, the board is, all they're doing is setting preliminary language. So that does not apply. You don't have to do any sort of...
So what is the protocol around that? What is that? I don't recall from last year.
Oh, you would just...
It's the Wild West?
It's the Wild West, which is, you just put forth a motion.
Yeah, who goes first?
Who's going first this year?
No, not for the preliminary. Yeah, no, that was the final. That was the final. I don't know. I believe so.
In the preliminary or preliminary, and then tenants go first in the final. That I remember that. All right. On that note, is there a motion?
You guys.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
I second.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much.